Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining tonight's webinar. This is Student Loan and Financial Best Practices for 2021 and 2022 Physician Assistant Graduates. My name is Brandon Barfield. I'm one of the co-founders and currently the president of a company called Doctors Without Quarters. We're also joined tonight by Jason DiLorenzo. So Jason is the original founder of Doctors Without Quarters and has recently started a new venture that's pretty exciting, which is called PSLFjobs.com. And we're going to be talking more about that as we get into the PSLF forgiveness discussion a little bit later in tonight's presentation. So in case you're wondering why we're opening this up to two classes instead of one, well, you're probably already familiar with the concept of, depending on what program you're in, PAs tend to graduate all throughout the year, right? Some of you graduate in the spring, fall, summer, and so that's why we're kind of opening up to tonight to make sure we get everyone access to this important information. Now, first of all, quick background about Doctors Without Quarters. So DWOQ is a student loan advisory, and we specialize in helping physicians and other graduate health professionals to strategically manage your student loan debt. So we've been doing this for about a decade now, and we partner with many programs across the country, PA, physicians, med school, veterinary programs, you name it. Pretty much anyone with a graduate degree in the healthcare sector, we've met with them and worked with them over the years and partner with many of the schools nationwide to provide education. So really two key components to what we do. Number one is education. So we do our best, whether it's a webinar format or a dedicated exit counseling for your school or some sort of healthcare professional conference or affiliation. Anytime we get a chance to get in front of an audience and present this information to help graduates better manage their student loan debt, we always jump on that opportunity because generally speaking, there's just not enough information out there, in our opinion, to help recent graduates manage their debt, be informed about the programs that are out there, and a step beyond that to really show you a strategic approach to managing your debt, which is really where your savings comes into play. You've got to have a debt management strategy. Now, the other component of what we do is we are an individual advisory, and we work with over 1,000 graduates every single year to dive in, look at their unique circumstances, talk about their loan repayment options, how they complement their debt portfolio and their career path, and help them formulate a strategy that is unique to them. And we often end up working with them on an ongoing basis until the day their debt is retired. So I'll talk a little bit more about those resources near the end in case you might be interested in some of that hands-on and one-on-one support. All right. Now let's get into our agenda tonight. So we're going to start off by talking about the loan repayment marketplace, specifically the federal loan repayment options. So we'll get into the traditional plans and very quickly move into what's called income-driven repayment plans that I think many of you are going to appreciate. I've got some case studies that I think you're really going to find practical and reliable to really kind of help put some real numbers with these concepts. You can get an idea of what loan repayment strategy might be good for you. Now, that's going to segue quite nicely into public service loan forgiveness. So Jason's going to come in and he's going to talk about the public service loan forgiveness program, break it down, how it's applicable to you, and give you an idea of whether or not you, based off your career path, might want to pursue that program. It is quite lucrative, but there's some ins and outs and some concerns that go with that. So we're not just going to tell you how the program works. We're also going to talk about some of the news around the program and clear up some of the misinformation that's out there, because there is quite a bit. Now, there's some legislative updates, things like the CARES Act, the government's response to COVID-19, you probably all heard about, Fed loans giving up their contract. There's a lot going on in the student loan industry as of late, and we're going to get into some of that as well. Now, we're going to switch gears after that and talk about the refinancing marketplace. You guys have probably seen advertisements from companies like Laurel Road or SoFi, and there's about a dozen of them out there that specialize in student loan refinancing. Well, what is that? When is that a good move? Is that best for me, or should I stick with the federal programs? How do I know? We're going to answer all of those questions to give you a good understanding of how to leverage that and maximize your savings. Now, toward the end, I'm going to cover a few items which you'll probably find helpful, such as should I consolidate my loans? What are the pros and cons of consolidation? What's the difference between consolidation and refinancing? We get that question a lot. dealing with loan servicers, how your credit score and credit considerations come into play. And then toward the end, we'll wrap up. We'll cover our resources available in case you'd like to engage us. We'll go through that part pretty quickly. And then Q&A. So there is a question and answer field. Now, there's also a chat field. I'm going to ask you to please use the Q&A field and not the chat field, if you will. It just helps us kind of organize the questions a little bit better. You're welcome to ask questions throughout the presentation, but sometimes it's helpful to save a little bit of time if you'll kind of write down your question, maybe hold it till the end. You may find that we get to your question through our normal dialogue as we start going through our content. So it's up to you. Post it early, post it late. Either way is completely fine. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. First of all, why are we here? Now, I have to say, I was quite shocked as I started preparing for this. I've spoken to a lot of PA programs over the years, but this is our first one specifically for a national PA community. So we've got attendees on tonight's call that are from PA programs all across the country. And I was very surprised at how little data there is out there talking about the cost of getting a PA education and comparing the different debt levels and tuitions and total cost of attendance and all of that. And so, some of the data we found, this chart on the left, this is actually from 2014. And even way back then, it was already showing that roughly a quarter of program graduates were racking up over $100,000 in debt, with the majority of the rest between 50 and 100. I don't think it's a far stretch to say that most programs today, you're coming out with probably 75 to 175, and some of you have more than that on average, and that's just from the clients we work with. We've seen those numbers firsthand, and we know how large they can get. And then the chart on the right, this is pretty interesting. So this is only for the state of California, but it does a great job of showing how wide of a gap there is between the costs of different programs. So you've got Western down here, and this is only tuition, by the way. This isn't total cost of attendance, which can add up quite quickly, but $71,000 down here versus $171,000 up here at USC. And so most of you probably fall somewhere within that range between these programs. All right. So what we're going to do tonight as we start getting into some of these concepts and case studies, I'm actually going to show you two parallel sets of case studies, one at $75,000 in total debt, and then one at $150,000 in total debt. And hopefully most of you on tonight's call can relate to one of those two numbers. All right. Now, when we go ahead and transition in to the different loan repayment options available, I like to split these into two different groups. So group one is your more traditional plans that have been available for many years. So you've got your standard 10-year repayment plan, and that's kind of the default on your loans. If you don't pick a payment plan, that's the one your servicer tends to put you in. And that's very straightforward math. You take the loan, you divide it by the interest rate and divide it out by 10 years, and your payments are fixed over a 10-year period. Some of you will choose to pay your loans down on a very straightforward 10-year payment plan. Others of you might look for something that's a little more affordable and try to stretch out your payments. Well, you can do a 25-year repayment option, or if you consolidate 60,000 or more, you can even do a 30-year repayment option. But what we see more often than not is when graduates, especially graduate level, graduates tend to look at lower cost repayment options. They more often than not start leaning toward the income-driven repayment plans, which we'll get to in just a moment. But one thing I'll caution you, and I'm going to show you this on the case study in just a moment. When you start talking about 25 and 30-year repayment plans, yes, that brings down your payment, but the downside to that is anytime you're carrying a debt that long, the interest cost gets pretty substantial. A good rule of thumb at today's interest rates, if you borrowed, say, $100,000 and you're going to take 25, 30 years to pay it back, your total cost of debt is basically going to be double what you borrowed. So it would cost you roughly $200,000 to retire that loan. Okay. Now, there's another plan out there called the graduated plan. It's not utilized very often. It's a 10-year time frame. Payments start out a little bit smaller, and they get a little bit bigger on the back end. That might be an option for some of you. And then you may have heard the option of forbearance. Now, forbearance is only available in very specific circumstances. For instance, medical trainees sometimes can do a forbearance if they want to. There's different types of hardship deferment and forbearance out there. Sometimes if your servicer is processing your application, They might put your loans into an administrative forbearance for a couple of months while they go through their paperwork. But forbearance is definitely not going to be a long-term strategy once you get to graduation. Okay, so I just want to throw that out there in case you've heard that term out there in the mix. Now, the other way to go with your loan repayment is on the income-driven repayment plans, and I'll refer to these as IDRs through the rest of the presentation. So at a high level, your income-driven payment plans work essentially the same. So as the name implies, they focus on your income as opposed to your total debt level to calculate how much you have to pay each and every month. So the plans are specifically designed to provide relief to those who have very high debt to income ratios. The Department of Education doesn't want you spending half your take-home pay, or even more in some circumstances, just to make your student loan payment every month. So what they basically do is kind of toss your total debt number out the window, and instead they look at your income to calculate your debt. Well, there's a lot of different ways to look at your income, right? So under these particular programs, they're looking at what's considered your discretionary income, and that's a product of your AGI, your adjusted gross income, which can only be found on last year's tax returns. That's very important. We'll come back to that. And then they subtract out a fixed amount for the federal poverty level. It's based off your family size. It goes up a little bit each year. Right now, it's about $19,000 for a family size of one, and it quickly gets up into the $20,000, $30,000 range as your family size goes up, okay? So at a high level, all the plans are based off that general concept. However, there are different plans to choose from, and this is where the complexities and the confusion start coming in. So many borrowers complain, there's just too many plans out there. I don't know which one's best for me. The different features are confusing. So let me break down some of the important features of these plans, okay? You've got IBR, pay and repay. There's a couple other plans out there as well that aren't nearly as beneficial as these. So these are the three most popular we're going to focus on. First of all, your payment calculation. IBR, your payment is based off 15% of your discretionary income. Pay as you earn and repay are 10%. So right off the bat, most of today's graduates are focused on these two plans, pay and repay. Now, as you first get into payment, you're going to find early on your payment is very likely to be less than your standard 10-year payment amount, because you can often document the fact that you weren't even working last year. You're just now transitioning out of school. But eventually you may find, depending on your debt versus income, sometimes your income-driven payment amount isn't any less than your 10-year. In fact, it could be more than your 10-year. So that's where this feature comes in. This is a cap. IBR and pay as you earn have a cap that will never force you to pay more than your standard 10-year payment amount. Now, borrowers that we talk to, we often tell them, hey, that's a kind of a red flag. If your income is getting to the point that you're hitting that break-even point, it may not make sense for you to be on these plans at all at that point in your career, unless you're pursuing a forgiveness opportunity. In that case, that cap stops your payments from going up further and gets you more forgiveness on the back end, okay? So that'll come back into play in a little bit. But notice that the repay plan does not have any sort of cap. The more you make, the more you're going to pay under the repay plan. So that may not be as beneficial for those that are higher income earners or have a lower debt load, or a combination of both. Now, interest subsidy. It's important to note that while these plans base your payment off of your income, you are still ultimately on the hook for whatever your interest cost happens to be based off your interest rate. So if you've got $100,000 at 6%, that's a $6,000 annual interest cost. Sometimes you'll find that your payment is actually less than your monthly interest accrual. And so technically your debt level is going up and not down. And that happens very common in the early part in your career for a lot of graduates. That's called negative amortization. Now, certainly if that happens too far down the road and you're not pursuing forgiveness, that's a bad thing, right? You don't want to be in that circumstance for very long, but it's okay if that happens at the forefront of your career. But notice this right here in the repay, it says 50% interest subsidy. Now, this is a really neat benefit, and no income-driven payment plan before repay was introduced had this particular benefit. Under repay, if your payment is less than your interest per month, they're going to take 50% of that unpaid interest and just forgive it in real time, tax-free each and every month. and then the other percent carries forward on your account. So that's a really great benefit that can save you some pretty substantial money, especially your first few years after graduation. We're going to show that in a case study here in a few minutes. Now, taxes. The biggest question by far we get when we talk about income-driven payment plans is how on earth does this work if I'm married? Do I file married joint? Do I file married separate? What if my spouse has student loans? And we're going to talk about this some now, then we're going to circle back to it in a few minutes as well. But here's the answer right here in the chart. IBR and pay-as-you-earn do give you the option to file your taxes married filing separate. That way only your income shows up on your tax return, and then only your income would be used to calculate the payment. So inversely, if you were to file married jointly, yes, your payment would include your spouse's income in the calculation, and obviously that's going to be a higher payment. Now, the exception to that rule is if you and your spouse both have substantial debt, you both want to be on an income-driven payment plan, you can do it together and they'll divide that payment out proportionally between the two of you, and we'll expand a little bit more upon that in a few minutes. But let's get back down here to repay. Notice that repay says married filing jointly. They wrote this program from the start to be less beneficial to married borrowers. They don't give you the option to do married filing separate. So if your spouse has an income and doesn't have debt to offset that income, you're probably going to find that it doesn't take a whole lot of spousal income to drive your payment up pretty substantially. So for those of you who are married to a spouse that earns a decent income, you may find that repay is not the plan for you, especially long-term. All right. Generally speaking, loan repayment becomes significantly more complex when you're married. I just want to give you a heads up on that. Okay. If you're married, whether or not your spouse has debt, you want to spend some more time on your strategy because there's a lot more details to consider there. Now, forgiveness. Not to be confused with public service loan forgiveness. All of these plans have their own standalone forgiveness options. If you stay in these plans long-term, 20 or 25 years, if there's any debt remaining at the end, that debt would be wiped out after that 20 or 25 year period. But it's important to note that the forgiveness amount is taxable, and it's based off whatever your tax bracket happens to be at that time, which none of us have a clue, right? What tax bracket's going to look like 20, 25 years from now. But it's simply added, the forgiveness amount is added on to your earned income in that year, and then you owe taxes accordingly. So when we get into a case study here, I'm going to talk about that tax burden and how you can plan for that if you wanted to stretch your loans out that long. Okay, so I know it's a lot to take in a short amount of time, but those are really the highlights of the programs. And essentially, these are also going to be your decision points when you start thinking about what sort of plan do I want to be on. And you don't have to stay on the same plan long term. You can change plans, which we'll expand upon. Now, let's go ahead and start putting some numbers behind these concepts. And I think you'll really appreciate as we start getting into this. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to show two parallel case studies. One at $75,000 in debt, which should give you an interest rate of around 6.25%, depending on when you took out your loan. Some of you have more grad plus than others, depending on how your terms were laid out, and an $85,000 starting salary. And then also $150,000 in debt, higher interest rate because you've definitely got more grad plus loans built into this portfolio, quite a bit in fact, and maybe you got a little bit higher starting salary. Now, does a higher starting salary always correlate with a higher debt amount? Of course not. Most of you are going to find that how much you borrow for school actually has nothing to do with how much you're going to make, but you certainly want to keep that in mind. Now, let's break this down. First of all, your accruing interest at $75,000 in debt, your monthly interest accrual is about $391. That's a number that you need to figure out based off your unique portfolio and always be close to that number because that's kind of your break-even point, right? If you're paying less than that, your debt level is going up. That's that negative amortization again. If you're paying more than that per month, then you are covering all of your interest and you're chipping away at your principal. Okay, so always know what your monthly interest accrual is. Standard 10-year payment plan, $842 per month. Sometimes when you're doing early budgeting, you may actually find it's easier to look at things from an annual perspective. So in this case, about $10,000 per year. So if I'm making $75,000 gross, I'm probably taking home $60, $65 after taxes. So can I afford to put 1/6 of my income toward my debt? Well, maybe yes, maybe no, right? It all depends on your individual budget and expenses and all that. But if you say no, or at least not early on, I need a cheaper option, that's where these income driven payment plans start coming into play. So keep in mind, they're not just based off your paycheck, they're based off that previous year AGI. So if we look at a short term play here, first year, well, your tax returns show that you probably didn't make anything because you were a student last year. You can get a $0 payment in year one. And yes, popular question, is that payment, do I get subsidy off that? Does it count toward forgiveness? The answer is yes. You still get your full benefit. You are still in repayment for all intensive purposes. Second year, depending on the timing of when you graduate, for instance, if you graduate in the spring and start your job in maybe July or August, well, you're only going to show about half a year of income, right? And that's reflected on your tax return in a very low payment year. And it wouldn't be until year 3 that your tax returns actually start reflecting that full-time income. So if you're making about $75,000 a year, or excuse me, $85,000 a year, that's going to give you a payment of around $800, $831 per month, and it's only going to grow gradually from there as your income goes up. Okay, so that gives you an idea of where your payments are headed after your first 2 transition years. Now, sticking with that same information, well, that's about $3,500 in repay interest savings. Now, would I call that substantial in the grand scheme of things? Probably not. You know, your payment here is so close to your standard 10-year payment after the first 2 years, that repay benefit, it phases out right here as soon as you hit year 3. So that's a pretty short-term benefit over the first 2 years. But if we kick this up a notch and we go to that higher debt level, even with $100,000 starting salaries, you're going to see here the dynamic starts to change quite a bit. First of all, our monthly interest accrual went up to $813. That's just the interest alone per month. So a much more substantial number there, right? Standard 10-year payment, $1,700 a month, $20,000 obligation. So even if you're making $100K, that is a higher percentage of your take-home pay. And it leaves that question again, can I take this on early on in my career? When you look at the payments here, $664 per month, $672 per month. And guys, forgive me, I've switched the payments here. So that was my mistake. I apologize. So the 800 numbers go down here at the 100,000 and the 600 numbers go up here to the 75,000. Very sorry about that. But you get an idea there about your payment obligation, but it's the same dynamic. You have a lower payment obligation in years 1 and 2, and then it's going to kick up to the $800 range beyond that, and it's going to grow steadily and proportionally as your income grows. But take a look at this. Your repay interest savings, in this case, it lasted for about 4 years before it started to phase out, was nearly $10,000 that you should have accumulated in interest, but was all forgiven completely tax-free in real time. So even if you abandoned the program that next year and started aggressively paying down your debt or refinanced or something like that, you get to keep all of that savings, okay? So think about pay versus repay, your short-term and long-term benefits, and whether or not you think those programs might be a good fit for you, okay? Now, let's switch gears here and look at some longer-term numbers. So same case studies. Let's go back to that $75,000 in debt, $85,000 starting salary, 3% annual increase. First of all, if I did the standard 10-year payment plan, that debt's going to cost me about $100,000. So only about a $25,000 interest cost there at the end of the day. In the grand scheme of things versus all the different borrowers we work with day in and day out, I'd say that's a relatively low cost of debt. However, if you can afford those standard 10-year payments, you can actually bring that cost of debt down even more, most likely by refinancing. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. Now, the 25-year extended is going to cost you about $150,000. Like I said earlier, 25, 30 years, you basically take your initial cost of debt and you double it, and that's what you're going to pay. Some pretty straightforward, quick math there. Now, look at this. At this debt to income level, your income is a little bit higher than your debt. A good rule of thumb when you're trying to decide, are these plans a good fit for me long term? Some rough math is, do I have as much debt as I do starting salary when I first start this process? If you have as much debt or more, then yes, the numbers will probably add up in your favor to stay on these plans long term. In this case, our debt's lower than our starting salary, and that plays out in the numbers. So your pay-as-you-earn payments, about $140,000 from start to finish, and you paid it off in 19 years, roughly. Keep in mind, it takes 20 years to get forgiveness, and forgiveness is all or nothing. So 19 years doesn't get you, 19 out of 20, fraction of forgiveness or proportion of forgiveness. And so, if you want to run these numbers ahead of time, and if you see you're not a good candidate for forgiveness, you probably don't want to be on the pay-as-you-earn plan for 19 years. Likely, once again, we could have refinanced into maybe a 15-year refi and given you a similar, if not lower, cost of debt and a much more straightforward repayment plan. Now, if we get into repay, same thing. We saved a little bit of interest on the front end, and you see that helped us to pay off our loans a little quicker and brought down our cost of debt just a little bit. So this is one of the few scenarios where repay comes out cheaper than pay because we're not pursuing forgiveness. As you're about to see on the next case study, that's not usually the case at the higher debt to income ratio. So let's look at that. $150,000 in debt, $100,000 starting salary, 10-year payment, about $204, 25-year payment, once again, roughly double, $304. Now take a look at this. Your pay-as-you-earn payments, if this 3% increase held true, now this is a linear model, right? You're not going to increase at exactly 3%, but we're trying to model it out here. $186,000 is your initial cost of debt. The loan balance forgiven at year 20 was $159,000. Now, that is taxable. So let's just assume roughly a 30% marginal tax bracket. That's going to bring your total out-of-pocket cost up to $234. Is that a good deal? Well, let's compare it. The 10-year plan cost you $204, and you had to pay back all that debt in half the amount of time. This only added 30%, not the double we looked at earlier. And most of this cost came on the back end, and some came on the very, very back end in the form of what we call the tax bomb or the tax liability. So when you look at the time value of money, having access to more of your money early on to invest or grow your career, whatever it happens to be, I'd say yes, that is a pretty good deal if I'm looking for a longer term repayment strategy. Now, repay came out to $297. When forgiveness makes sense, we have always seen that repay is going to end up costing you more than pay, and that is because it's 5 years longer that it takes to get to forgiveness. It's a 25-year program instead of a 20. Okay, so if you are thinking, I want to do a long-term forgiveness strategy, you're probably going to want to lean toward the pay-as-you-earn plan and not repay, or you might can use repay for a few years, capture the interest subsidy, and then switch over to pay. That does not reset the payment clock. You can capture the shorter 20-year. We don't see a lot of people doing that because we think they're going to change these plans up a few years down the road and you won't be able to switch between them, but that's a conversation for later. Now that tax bomb, your payments range from $650 to $1,250 under this case study. So you need to prepare at a 30% marginal tax bracket. That's about a $45,000 to $50,000 tax bill in 20 years. You don't want to wait until you're 20 till you get the bill and try to come up with 50 grand, right? You want to plan for this. You can do it 5 years out, 10 years out, or a lot of our clients, we see a lot of veterinary graduates. They've got very similar profiles to PA as far as their economics. A lot of vet graduates we work with, they're dividing it out from the start per month, and they're going ahead and they're adding it on to their loan repayment budget, and they're putting that money away into a conservative investment right from the start. And that way they know they've got the majority of that money sitting there waiting for them. And they're not worried about the tax bomb at all. Okay, so you can plan for this stuff right from the start, but I definitely recommend that you plan for it at least 5 or 10 years out if you don't do it right from the start. Okay, so that's a lot of numbers thrown at you, but I hope that also helps kind of, turn on the light bulb, if you will, and help make a lot more sense out of these concepts. You can start getting an idea of what your payment budget is. Now, we're going to talk about some more aggressive or more straightforward repayment strategies, such as refinancing in a little bit. But until we get to that, I want to take a few moments and unpack a couple of these nuances real quick, and then I'm going to hand it over to Jason to talk about public service loan forgiveness. But real quick, I mentioned earlier getting married and how that can become a little complex. So if you are married, ask yourself the question, or start taking the time to break down. Does your spouse have student loans? If so, do they have enough debt to be on one of these plans as well, or is their debt, relatively insubstantial and probably doesn't justify being on one of these plans? How's their income? Are they making 20 grand a year or 200 grand a year, right? There is a certain break even point where it may or may not make sense to break out your taxes and your state as well. Find out if you live in a community property state. A community property state, it's not an even split. They combine your incomes and divide it down the middle. So if your spouse makes more than you, that raises your payment. If your spouse makes less than you, well, you put some of your income on them and that brings your payment down. So the state and the individual tax laws make a big difference. Of course, your income projections, do you ever have a period without income? Is your income going to go up or down more in certain years? So think about your income planning. And then finally, switching programs. You can switch between programs. It does capitalize interest, so it's not something you want to do too often. But it is quite common to see borrowers, as they hit different milestones in their career, such as getting married or a job change with a substantial rise in income, or maybe it's the end of that repay subsidy period, where it might make sense to switch from one program to another to really lock in and maximize your savings and kind of let your long-term strategy start to evolve. Final tip on this: worst thing you can do is set a strategy today and then 5-10 years down the road think that that's still going to be the most effective strategy. The only thing certain in this industry is change. We see so many changes day in and day out. You have to make sure you're constantly reevaluating your loan repayment options, as the programs will evolve around you, even if your career path goes exactly according to plan. All right. So if you've got questions on that, you can put those in the Q&A field and we'll take those here in a little bit. But for now, I'm going to hand it on over to Jason, and he's going to start unpacking the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program for us. Hey, Jason, how's it going?
Hey, Brandon, how you doing? Let me just I didn't get to do it earlier. Quick sound check here. I'm using my fancy new podcasting mic, so I want to make sure that my sound is good, or if I need to make some adjustments, we'll do it before I start yapping.
Yeah, man, you sound like a DJ. Go for
it. Thanks, Brandon. I wanted to add one bit of light. I know I think we have a slide on legislation later, but when we talk about the tax bomb, a couple of tax benefits showed up in the recent CARES Act and then the American Rescue Plan from President Biden in March of this year. One eliminates tax liability on all student loan cancellation or forgiveness, including anything that would be canceled through efforts of the administration, either through an act of Congress or through an executive order. There's been discussion of loan cancellation. I think Brandon and I are both on the page of we don't expect to see broad student loan cancellation for everyone, but rather more targeted. But another component of that is that income-driven repayment plan loan forgiveness would be available tax-free, no tax bomb. This is in place through the year 2025, and we would hope this sets a trend for the future where tax liabilities many years into your career wouldn't be due. That doesn't feel like the intent of these programs. So stay tuned on that sort of legislative front. But right now, the tax bomb doesn't exist. For you guys, it's still in place technically in the promissory notes and then the legislation and otherwise. But then in the future, it looks like the administration, at least our current administration, is seeking to remove that type of tax liability and just keep your skin in the game with respect to repayment for X number of years based on the program. So a next logical step in talking about these income-driven repayment plans, which offer loan forgiveness that is taxable, hopefully tax-free, in 20 to 25 years would be the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. You've probably at least seen some information about this in the media. I don't know how much your schools directly are teaching you about this program other than providing a resource like this to be available to you. But suffice it to say, in our experience, PA graduates tend to have good opportunities for PSLF. So I want to talk about exactly how this works and then talk about the benefits that are available and when it makes sense to pursue this more than in other cases. So let's first just define the requirements of public service loan forgiveness. There are three main components to this. If I'm to simplify it, I usually explain you have to have the right kind of loans while you're making the right kind of payment on those loans, and you're working full-time for the right kind of employer. These three things coexist for 10 cumulative years. And then at the end of that 10 years, you are eligible for tax-free, complete loan forgiveness on any balance left outstanding. So let's now break these three components down into their individual parts. What are eligible loans? Today, an eligible loan is any direct federal student loan. So Stafford loans, Grad Plus loans that you've taken specifically from PA school that have also higher interest rates attached to them, and any direct consolidation loan. Perhaps you borrowed some money in undergrad, consolidated that student loan debt at some point, then took on additional debt, say, for PA school. The consolidation loans that are direct would also count as eligible loans. All of you, if you went to school on or after July 1st of 2010, which is now over 11 years ago, you're going to have only direct student loans as your federal student loans, because that's when the government nationalized federal student loans. So your loans, if you've taken them all out on or after July 1st of 2010, are already eligible for PSLF. If for some reason you were taking out federal student loans prior to July 2010, it's possible or even probable that they came from private lenders that were participating in federal lending. Those aren't considered direct or Department of Education loans. They could be from Sallie Mae or Citibank or Discover or Wells Fargo. Those kinds of loans can be consolidated into a direct consolidation loan and then become eligible. So for the purposes of all people thinking about public service loan forgiveness, or to just simplify their student loans as they exit school and enter repayment, a lot of times we consider consolidating federal student loans into a single direct consolidation loan, which we know is eligible for PSLF or public service loan forgiveness, and also is easier to administer than a group of loans when it comes to dealing with your loan servicer and payments and all of that. So eligible loans must be direct federal student loans. Next part of it is you need to be an eligible repayment plan. Very simply put, this is any income-driven repayment plan that Brandon's been discussing here for the past few minutes. The most commonly used, as we see, and I think Brandon has well explained, normally we're going to see borrowers using either pay-as-you-earn or revised pay-as-you-earn, or if you have older federal student loans before before October 1st of 2007, if you had federal student loans and you didn't plan on using revised pay-as-you-earn, you'd have to use income-based repayment instead. And so income-based repayment, pay-as-you-earn, or revised pay-as-you-earn are really the three income-driven repayment plans that are driving value for public service loan forgiveness. So eligible payments must be made on an income-driven repayment plan. And then once you make 120 monthly income-driven payments, or that's 10 years, 120 months, then you can apply for public service loan forgiveness. And what that you're applying for is essentially to have your entire balance forgiven tax-free after that 10 years. And for some of you, this is going to be a substantial amount of savings opportunity if you meet requirement number 3, which is eligible employment. In this case, this is that you must be directly employed by any federal, state, or local government or agency. Think a VA hospital or a county medical center, or any 501c3 nonprofit organization, of which there are about 12.5 million jobs in the United States that meet this requirement. Most commonly, hospitals employ many of their clinicians directly from 501c3 nonprofit organizations. So the greatest opportunity we see for PAs here is direct employment by a 501c3 nonprofit hospital. As long as you're working full-time, which is an average of 30 hours per week for at least 8 months in a given year, or your employer's definition of full-time, this will be available to you. So right kind of loans, direct loans, right kind of payment plan, an income-driven repayment plan, and the right kind of employment, full-time employment by a qualifying entity. This doesn't have to be the same employer for 10 years. We do this for doctors all the time, and they go into, say, residency at a teaching hospital, then maybe fellowship at a different teaching hospital. Then they go into practice at a nonprofit hospital. I'm in Arizona, call it Banner Health. out here in Arizona, which employs their physician assistants directly from the 501c3 nonprofit that Banner Health is. Not a pitch for Banner, just using an example that's in my backyard. So if you think about when Brandon is presenting these income-driven repayment plans that are showing you $100,000 or more of student loan debt left outstanding after 20 years of payments, imagine how much is left outstanding after only 10 years of payments when the program already has no tax liability attached to it. If you have an $85,000 income to start, 10 years down the road, assuming that income grows at 3% a year, as Brandon mentioned, we're talking about you coming out of pocket only $59,000 over those 10 years. Therefore, if you had $100,000 of federal student loan debt, you're actually paying $41,000 less than even what you borrowed. Those of you that have $200,000 or more, I mean, this improves that effective salary such that you're still only going to be paying based on your income, $59,000 over 10 years. So you can imagine that $200,000 of federal student loan debt, you're a lot more incented to go into a nonprofit or public service role because your savings that you're realizing is substantially greater in this way. So we always encourage PAs, particularly those with higher student debt levels, to consider public service loan forgiveness to be debt-free, tax-free 10 years into your career, which not many graduate professionals can boast these days unless they're in public service loan forgiveness type of roles. I also want to share with you that while we teach these programs to medical graduates almost religiously and have for the past 10 years, a lot of times, other than being invited to presentations like this, the word really isn't out on the street to PA graduates about the availability of public service loan forgiveness. And if I'm to hop on Indeed and start looking for jobs that are PSLF qualified for physician assistants, most of the people posting these jobs don't even know that their employer is qualified. They provide very little information about it. Less than 10% of PSLF qualified employers on Indeed are actually mentioning that as a benefit of working there. So it really is incumbent upon you to understand that this is available to you and maximize it. To that extent, we'll also want to talk about coverage about PSLF in the media today. There have been numerous articles over the past 3 to 4 years that are suggesting that PSLF applicants are being denied. Those who applied for this program years ago, the fact that they would be denied based on eligibility is completely expected. We have only now, as I mentioned before, the government nationalized student loans in July of 2010. And so public service loan forgiveness was announced and put into legislation in 2007. So there was a 3-year lag between people actually having the right kind of loans to be eligible for public service loan forgiveness. So fast forward to 2017 or 4 years ago, when the marketplace started looking for all these loan forgiveness candidates, those who were applying didn't have the right kind of loans like you guys typically do. Direct federal student loans. We didn't start seeing meaningful amounts of loan forgiveness until around this time last year, once we passed the 10-year anniversary of the 10-year anniversary of the nationalization of student loans in July of 2010. So now to date, we've seen about $580 million forgiven if we include expanded public service loan forgiveness in addition to the program itself. And 1.25 million people enrolled in the program, meaning they've gotten the Department of Education to approve that they have submitted some level of progress towards the 10 years required. I'll explain how that's done in a moment. And there's $124 billion in the public service loan forgiveness queue, which is growing rapidly. So is this program safe to pursue? Based on what you've seen in the media, you might think no. The fact is, in fact, this is in your master promissory notes. There is all kinds of class action liability around the government trying to take this away from you. For that reason, all proposals that the changes to either public service loan forgiveness or the income-driven payment plans, they seek to change things for future borrowers not current ones. And so even if we do see changes to this program in the future, as long as you meet those three requirements, which are easier to meet today than they were 10 years ago, you should be in line to achieve public service loan forgiveness. And it makes definitive sense to pursue it if in fact you're working in a qualified role. Those of you that with higher debt levels probably going to want to add public service loan forgiveness qualified jobs to your job search, because that really improves the effective salary that employer pays you when you factor in substantial loan forgiveness. Now, is there a place for you to go to find jobs that you know qualify for public service loan forgiveness? We've worked to create a jobs platform that features only PSLF qualified jobs. So we continue to add employers that are qualified for this program that want to work with you to help you maximize and pursue this. They understand the value that it offers to them in the terms of like a federal subsidy to what they pay you. So if you're interested in perusing jobs, there's about 13,000 jobs up on the PSLF jobs platform now and growing daily. So I would encourage you to peruse the PSLF jobs profile and available jobs as we continue to grow that in partnership with PSLF jobs, and also the American Osteopathic Association is our biggest partner there. In terms of certifying your employment, the other thing that I wanted to mention there is an employer responsibility to this. So if you're pursuing PSLF, you may run across HR or an authorized official at your hospital that is not familiar with the employment certification form. Once a year, you should use what's called the PSLF help tool available at studentaid.gov to make sure that your employer is listed in their database as a qualified employer, and then have your employer complete for you an employment certification form, which indicates that, for example, you, Brandon Barfield, started working at this employer October 1st, 2021 through October 1st, 2022, in a year from now. And then the employer certifies that they are a qualified 501c3 employer, that you worked there full time for that year. When you submit that form to the Department of Education, they come back to you and state, okay, you've now made 12 qualifying payments towards the 120 that are required for public service loan forgiveness, and you are documented in the Department of Education system as pursuing public service loan forgiveness. That's an important step that isn't mandatory, but one that we always guide people to do in our services. And we always try to talk to HR folks as well at qualified employers to make sure they're driving this process as best possible to help you guys out. So there is an employment documentation component to this. You want to make sure that you're doing annually, because nobody's going to come knock on your door and ask you to do it. It's something that you want to proactively make sure that you're doing. Now, Brandon, if you want to grab this legislation update, I see maybe a couple questions popped up, so I'll answer these in the field, and just in the Q&A or chat field.
Okay, sounds good. So yeah, legislative update, obviously what the government does has a big impact, right, on these programs and your savings potential. So it's important to keep up what's going on legislatively. Of course, the CARES Act, hopefully most of you have heard of this by now. The government's response to COVID-19, well, they said no payments on student loans, no interest on student loans. And if you are already in repayment, well, you don't have to make your payments or recertify your payments for the foreseeable future. All right, so that has been extended a number of times. This is actually an old slide I took the notes off of. This has been extended through January of 2022. Okay, that was the final extension. They are very much emphasizing this is the final extension, and borrowers are being told to prepare to go back into repayment as of that date. Now, exactly what repayment is going to look like and your exact payment and certification date, that's still a little bit up in the air. They haven't gotten that far with the details yet. Now, loan forgiveness, we heard a lot during the election cycle about $10,000 in loan forgiveness or $50,000 in loan forgiveness. Initially, it seemed like the $10,000 proposal had some decent support behind it. The president sent it off to the Justice Department, Department of Ed, because he kind of wanted somebody else to sign off on it. It looks like he doesn't want to executive order this thing, and it's very much started to fizzle. to the point where I'm really starting to wonder if it has any hope at all. Now, it could easily come back. We could hear an announcement tomorrow. But as of right now, it's not looking good, to be quite honest with you. Now, the $50,000 in loan forgiveness, guys, don't hold your breath. Okay. This has never had much support. The president himself shot this down shortly after the election. And even if they did do it, you better believe there'd be lots of income and other restrictions on it. So it probably wouldn't impact graduate health professionals anyway. So what we've seen out of this administration is very selected and targeted loan forgiveness for different groups whose schools went out of business or disabled, Americans, things of that nature, but not much talk of loan forgiveness for all. Finally, watch out for any sort of updates to the income-driven plans. There does seem to be bipartisan support that, hey, if these plans are kind of complicated, maybe there are too many to choose from, and they could very well consolidate the income-driven payment plans down to one. Watch out for that. Yes, it might be simpler, but when has it ever been a good thing when people took away your options? I would argue never, right? Because if repay is any indicator of what the new rules are going to look like, with more restrictions on graduate borrowers, and you can't do married filing separate, no cap on payment plans and that sort of thing, that's not so great for higher income earners with a graduate degree. Okay, so we'll keep a sharp eye on that. And some of you may want to find, I'm just going to stay on my current plan and hopefully grandfather me in and let me just stay on pay as you earn and do my 20 years or something like that, which we fully expect them to do. But until they actually pass the legislation and come out with those details, we don't know for sure. Okay, so definitely stay tuned in if you want to sign up for our newsletter. We do a pretty good job on our website and through our newsletters and blogs of keeping our readers and our clients up to date on what's going on legislatively. All right, so we are quickly getting up on the hour mark, and we have just spent almost an hour talking about nothing but federal loan repayment and forgiveness plans. And the reason that is because, first of all, we know many of you, this is your first time hearing about these options, right? So to make sure we went through them very well and thoroughly, but also to make sure, since so many of you likely will end up either in the public sector, or at least have an opportunity to work in the public sector, we really want to make sure you have a good understanding of how the PSLF opportunity works and take advantage of that, because there's just so much misinformation out there. So we're going to pick up the pace a little bit and push through the rest of the content here the next, hopefully 15, 20 minutes. And get on with our evening. Now, refinancing, private refinancing. This is a very straightforward concept. A lot of people confuse refinancing with consolidation. We're going to talk about consolidation here in a few minutes, but refinancing is simply swapping one debt for another debt that has better terms. Essentially going to a bank and taking out a new loan to replace your existing loan. So your opportunity for savings is to drop your interest rate. As I mentioned earlier, most of you have 6.5% interest rate. Well, I just helped a borrower 2 days ago lock in 2.25% on a $250,000 loan. Okay, so that is huge savings, and it's very straightforward math, and it's not complex to understand. In fact, you can refinance more than once as your profile improves, or you're ready to take on heavier payments or make more money, or whatever it happens to be. Now, your biggest consideration when you look at swapping federal debt for private debt is you give up your federal benefits. Well, what happens is when you take out that new loan, all the proceeds go to your federal loans and they zero out your federal loans. You are no longer a federal borrower at that point. That means you're no longer eligible for things like repay, CARES Act, PSLF. All of that is off the table, okay? Now, in fairness, the reason most people look to refinance anyway is because they're not really benefiting from those features or benefits, and they're looking for better features to complement their unique circumstances. So usually that's kind of an understood sacrifice, but we take it pretty seriously around here. This is a one-way street. You can't go back when you do it. So make absolutely sure that, number one, you understand what you're giving up, and number two, that you're comfortable with it and you thought it through, okay? But if you do want to do that, let me give you an example. When you refinance, and this isn't your Bank of America down the street. These are very specific lenders who have very specific products for professional students with standard student loan debt. Now, usually they offer 5, 7, 10, 15, and 20-year terms. Generally speaking, the shorter the term, the better the rate's going to be, but that also means the higher the payment, right? So you have to find a good balance there. So let me give you an example. If we took this 10-year loan in the middle at currently 6%, maybe it's closer to 6.5%, but if I've got $150,000 in debt and I could drop that down to 3%, which you could easily do right now in today's marketplace, because of the economy, as a result of COVID, we've seen rates go way, way down, 1 to 2% on average. We've never seen rates as low as they are today, and we've been doing this since this became a thing 8 years ago. But take a look at this. If I can drop a 6% loan down to a 3% loan, that's going to save me about $26,000 over the life of the loan. And once again, there's no legislative concerns, there's no forms, there's no income projections, married filing separate, none of that stuff you have to deal with. It's just straightforward interest rate math that anyone can appreciate. So for those of you who are a little bit turned off by the complexity of the income-driven payment plans, even if the numbers might add up in your favor, if you want something that's a little easier to understand with a more concrete outcome, we see many borrowers who like to refinance simply because it's a sure thing. They know exactly what they're spending. They know exactly what they're saving. Okay. Now, to do this, the recommended process is make sure you go through a suitability check, consider what you're giving up and what you're gaining. Consider your profile, your credit score. Do you need a cosigner? Do you need to clean up some bad credit, which we'll talk about in a moment? And then approach the marketplace. So it takes a long time to shop at all these lenders. You can't just window shop on their websites. They all list roughly the same range of rates, and it's a pretty big range, like 2% to 6% on a 5-year term. The only way to find out your exact offer is to take the time to fill out an application. Well, I don't think anybody on this call wants to fill out 8 or 10 applications, right? So what we do, this is a service that we do at absolutely no cost to you, is we rely on our expertise of doing this for years and the hundreds of refinances we do for our clients every year, and we can shop the market a lot of times just based off our experience and help you avoid and cut down some of that shopping time and help pair you up with a lender or lenders that are most likely to give you the best rate based off your profile. We just know certain lenders like to work with certain incomes or certain credit scores or certain terms, loan amounts, whatever it happens to be. So it's kind of a win-win. You don't have to pay us anything. You get a better rate, and instead they pay us a finder's fee. So they pay us so you don't have to. So it really is a win-win for all three parties. Our only interest here is to help you find the best rate in the marketplace and be happy with your savings. Okay, so this is something that we've been doing for years and quite successfully. So consider whether or not refinancing might be a good fit for you now or perhaps a few years down the road. All right, quickly moving on. When you start thinking about, well, how do I make these decisions? When do I make these decisions? Most of you are going to hit what we call the fork in the road at some point. Don't feel like you've got to have it all figured out right now. You know, early on in your career, or some of you aren't even graduated yet, unless you've got all the pieces of the puzzle kind of in place with your career and your family dynamic, you may not be ready to make long-term decisions. Maybe you want to use the income-driven payment plans to give you some early payment relief as you're kind of getting your career off the ground. Or maybe you think maybe there is a hospital opportunity down the road and you want to keep the door open for PSLF. That's completely fine. What you don't want to do is tread water for 15 or 20 years and be that person who's in pay-as-you-earn for 19 years when you should have refinanced 8 years into it and dropped your interest rate and put yourself on a pay down plan. It's okay to have a short-term strategy while you're figuring things out, but as soon as you can, you do want to kind of pick a horse and ride it and lock in whatever your long-term strategy is going to be. All right. And part of that situation and consideration is if you have multiple jobs on the table and maybe one is nonprofit and one is for-profit, and Jason touched on this briefly. If you find the nonprofit job doesn't pay quite as well as the for-profit, well, you need to make sure you're given the PSLF opportunity, the credit and the value that it's due. We've got some analysis we run for our clients, or we can put an annual earnings equivalent on that PSLF forgiveness amount and kind of add it on to the equation so you can really compare apples to apples. Sometimes you'll be quite surprised at how much that PSLF adds to the bottom line as far as your annual economic value from one job to another. Okay, so if you're not sure about that, or you don't think you're savvy enough crunching the numbers on your own, then let us help you crunch those numbers and do that analysis so you can make a financially educated decision. And obviously that's the best case scenario, right? I hope all of you have multiple job options you get to choose from and can sit there and kind of weigh between them. All right, a few other tips before we start to wind down. First of all, loan consolidation. I'm sure many of you are wondering, should I consolidate my loan? What exactly is loan consolidation? And Jason talked about this as the first step in the PSLF, requirements, that it's only direct loans. Most of you have direct loans anyway, but still you may want to consider a direct loan consolidation just to condense all of your loans down into one. Now, if you've got other loans that aren't direct, we highly recommend any sort of federal education debt that doesn't say the word direct in front of it. We highly recommend you consolidate that into a new federal direct consolidation loan. Now, other reasons, there's strategic factors. First of all, fewer loans lead to fewer mistakes. If you've got 8 loans and you condense them down to one, well, based off my experience, you've got 8 times less as many chances. I probably didn't say that right, but you get the point. Far less likely for you to have problems on your account. Maybe they're problems that you caused, maybe they're problems that servicers cause. Regardless, they're headaches and they're problems you want to avoid. And problems on student loans usually equal to some sort of savings you just missed out on. Okay, so it's a really big deal that you avoid as many errors as possible over the next however many years it takes to retire your debt. But they're easier to maintain, they're easier to keep an eye on. If there's a mistake, you're going to most likely catch it and fix it much more quickly, and your servicer is most likely to catch it and fix it as well. Now, strategic consideration, timing makes a big deal. All of you have a 6-month mandatory grace period after you graduate. Well, if your goal is to get PSLF as quickly as possible and to lock in maybe a $0 payment coming out of school, well, is a 6-month mandatory grace period helping you or hurting you? Think about it. Maybe it's just holding you back from kickstarting your strategy. We see a ton of medical graduates every year who choose to go ahead and consolidate because a consolidation is the one thing you can do right after graduation, and it actually allows you to bypass that 6-month mandatory grace period and go right into repayment and kickstart your strategy. If your payment's 0, well, why on earth would you push that forward? That 6 months of grace does not count toward PSLF. Keep in mind, you have to be in the repayment plan to get that credit. So, you don't want to sacrifice that 6 months unless there's some other reason to do it. Timing of income is a big deal. Am I starting a job? Am I leaving a job? What did last year's tax returns show? We spend a lot of time and put strategy in place to help our clients maximize the exact income documentation they use and the timing of that income to help them get as low of payments as possible and as many payments at that low amount as possible. Okay. So when you start thinking about, yeah, go ahead, Jason.
Oh, I'll add to that, Brandon. Those of you that would have a payment based on your income profile in an income-driven repayment plan, because we have the CARES Act out to February 1st of next year. If you consolidate now and indicate your interest in being in an income-driven repayment plan, you'll have that documented for progress towards the income-driven repayment plan forgiveness, as well as PSLF. You won't have a payment till February 1st anyway. So that, I think, even highlights the benefit of consolidation for many of you, even more so.
Yeah, exactly. Me personally, sometimes schools raise an eyebrow when we tell a borrower who's got all direct loans, you should consolidate. You don't have to. But we've seen so many borrowers have different complications and problems on their accounts that would have been avoided if they would just consolidated at the front end after graduation. That's the biggest reason, personally, I tend to be a fan of it. If you do not consolidate early on and you start making income-driven payments, do not consolidate, because that will reset your payment clock on all of the forgiveness opportunities and capitalize your interest. Okay, so either you consolidate within that first 6 months after graduation or don't do it ever. Okay, so that is an early decision point that you need to make early on and then stick with it beyond that. All right, servicers. I mentioned earlier, problems on accounts. Find out who your servicer is. Your servicer, you're never going to deal with direct loans or Department of Education. You're going to deal with whatever servicer has been contracted and selected to service or manage your loan. They're the people that process your application. They run the websites, you make your payments and you log in. and all of that. Okay. And that's good. Use those services, make sure you have a login and you're staying on top of everything, especially your first year after graduation. Any sort of communication you get from your servicer is probably very important. Coming out of the CARES Act is going to be very important communications over the next 6 months as well. That said, please, please, please do not think of your servicer as your student loan or financial advisor. Most of the time, 90% probably, when we have a borrower with a problem with their loans and we have to get on the three-way call and help them sort it out with the servicer, the problem was caused by the servicer in the first place. I've got one client right now that's probably missing out on about $100,000 of PSLF because she called in and she asked her servicer, what payment plan do you think I should be in? And they gave her some very, very bad advice without properly asking the proper questions about her income and her future income projections. And it just so happened her income was doubling the next year. And they told her to go into repay, which once again has no cap on it. Okay. So if you don't know how to make these decisions, work with us, talk to your financial aid office or someone else you trust. Be wary of financial advisors and planners. A lot of times they don't understand these programs either. But these are very, very critical decisions that can have very costly outcomes. Okay, so be careful where you're getting your advice. Finally, credit. We could spend another hour talking about financial concepts outside of student loans, right? I certainly won't do that. But one of the biggest things that plagues graduate health professionals is they come out, they got the new job, they're making good money, they're ready to buy a house, they're ready to buy a car, maybe they want to refinance their student loans, and they get their credit pulled and they've got a 620 credit score or something like that. Okay, so it's important to start thinking about your credit as early on as you can. I'm sure everyone just knows instinctively that, hey, if I've missed a lot of payments in the past, my credit score probably sucks, right? And people don't want to lend me credit and extend me credit, things of that nature. That's pretty intuitive. What most of you probably don't know or may not know, the amount that you owe. A lot of you have, the emergency credit card that you had to put expenses on throughout school. And of course, you haven't had a job, so it just goes up and you can't afford to pay it down right now. Well, if you've only got $1,000 credit to your name and you're carrying an $800 balance, that looks really bad. Okay, you want to keep your credit utilization below 50% as well as possible. So if you're in that situation, you can't afford to pay it down, believe it or not, you may be better off just opening up a second line of credit, getting another credit card, but don't use it. And now you just upped it to 2,000 and now you're below that utilization ratio. Okay. But if you're fairly responsible with your budget and your spending and you understand what you can and cannot afford from month to month, then consider putting your day-to-day expenses on a credit card instead of a debit card. I personally put everything I can, cell phone bill, food, eating out, gas, whatever, my daughter's gymnastics tuition, it all goes on the credit card. We pay it off every single month in full, so we don't pay any interest. But boy, that credit activity does wonders for our household credit score, and it earns a lot of points and perks on the side, okay? But don't do that if you have trouble staying in your budget and that sort of thing. That's not for those who are not great financially, as far as your spending, okay? So use your best judgment there. All right, let's go ahead and wrap this up, and then we'll circle back and take some questions. So if you are interested in engaging us, first of all, our services, we like to be very straightforward and very transparent with our services, okay? So our core services are student loan consultation. I would argue that's really what has built this company. Over the years, this is what most people come to us for is, hey, I want to sit down with you. I want to look at my individual loans, talk to someone who understands this stuff and talk about my options, model out the numbers. All of these case studies we've shown you tonight, we run these sort of analytics for each and every borrower that we work with. So it's about an hour. It's done via Zoom video call. You're seeing the numbers on the screen. We can run as many what-if scenarios that you want about your career. And then not only will we help you hone in on a strategy, we're going to send it to you in writing with the full action plan, and we will help you execute the initial action plan. For instance, if you need to consolidate and apply for an income-driven payment plan or maybe switch or recertify your plan, we'll have you share your screen and we will walk you through that application step by step. Or maybe you're still in school and haven't graduated yet. That's fine. We'll get back on the phone with you after graduation and help you with those initial applications, even if it's 6 months from now. Okay. But it's very important to note that's included with the price. So $389 for individuals. If you're married, that's fine too. Only pay the couple's fee if your spouse also has significant debt. And we need to help both of you with your debt loads. Okay. So important there. If you're married, your spouse doesn't have debt or doesn't need help, you do not have to pay the couple's fee. Now, we are running a little promo right now through the month of October. We will knock 10% off that price. You can punch in the coupon code PA10 when you register, and I'll tell you how to register here in just a moment. Okay. A lot of people have asked over the years, well, hey, how do I get access to my advisor throughout the years? How do I get help with a servicer if they make my life difficult? How can I run these numbers on a regular basis to make sure the forgiveness strategy still makes sense, or if I need to change plans, whatever? As a response to those requests, several years ago, we rolled out our annual service offering. What we did is we took the annual the consultation, we knocked the price down as low as we possibly could to still make a living as a company. And we include the full consultation and everything you need to stay on top of your strategy from day in and day out. That includes us getting on a call with your servicer if needed, if something goes awry. That includes unlimited access to your advisor throughout the year as needed. And we're, of course, going to help you track all of your certified PSLF payments and all that other stuff and answer any other financial questions that you may have. And we break it down quarterly. It's only $75 a quarter. You can only do that after your initial consultation. Everyone has to do that initial consultation, and that's an optional service. Finally, free refinancing once again, whether it's now, 3 years down the road, whenever. All you have to do is go to our website. You'll see the services tab on the website, and you can sign up for any of these services. The whole process is automated. The registration, the payment, the scheduling. You'll open up a schedule. You'll have all sorts of days and times to choose from, including evening hours as well, if needed. So let me just say, if your school invited you to this webinar, we appreciate them inviting you. The school certainly did not endorse our fee-based services. These are completely optional, and they're completely on you if you want to engage us or not. And then the final thing I'll say is if you think that a presentation such as this might have been beneficial for your graduating class to help you be prepared to enter the job market, or maybe if you're a school administrator joining us tonight and you think this content would be helpful for your graduates, then let us know. Shoot us an email at help@dwoq.com and let us talk to you. Once again, we do lots of individual exit counselings for individual schools throughout the year all over the country. And that's really what we enjoy doing, to be honest with you. So we would love to partner with your school on a more dedicated basis.